Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Again, welcome to this week's office hours for ESG and ESGCV. My name is LaQuantia Goodman, and I am today's moderator. If you are just joining us, please go to the chat and introduce yourself with your name and the region you represent. As a reminder, this office hours session is being recorded for public record. Office hours recordings are on the California ESGCV past trainings webpage, and a copy of the slide deck will also be emailed to you. Next slide. How to ask a question. All questions must be submitted in the chat box. Please type your organization and question into the chat box. The team will read questions out loud at the end of the presentation and will provide answers, if possible, throughout the presentation. All questions and answers entered in the chat box will be recorded as part of the public record. Alongside our presenters, we also have several HCD staff, including ESG representatives, ESGCV grant administrators, and other consultants who are able to answer questions during the question and answer session. Next slide. Today's office hours agenda includes ESG resources and ESGCV updates, office hours updates, upcoming trainings, ESG and ESGCV question and answer, and our Spotlight Series presentation, Housing Stability Case Management. Next slide. When you receive this presentation, you will see here the ESG policy documents. Please access those resources as needed at your convenience. Next slide. The ESG team representatives. You have Diana, Giovanni, Tuesday, and Anthony. Please reach out to them using their individual email addresses, or you can reach out to the email address of esgnofa@hcd.ca.gov. Next slide. ESGCV updates. Reminders for performance milestones. All program funds for projects, street outreach, emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention, all must be expended by September 30th, 2023. All funds for HMIS and administrative costs shall be expended by October 31st, 2023. And all final RFFs must be submitted to the department no later than November 15th, 2023. Next slide. On March 29th, which is next Wednesday, during our office hours, we will cover building a bridge to avoid the cliff, continuing housing and services after ESGCV. This will be our Spotlight Series for next week. This session will discuss the continuation of projects created or expanded through ESGCV after the sunset of the program. California HCD and Cal ICH will discuss the end of the ESGCV program and the potential to use flexible state funds to continue providing housing and services. Next slide. HCD office hours updates. As just discussed, next week we will have the building a bridge to avoid the cliff. On April 5th, de-escalation. April 12th, emergency shelter policy and shelter inspection reports. And April 19th, client file checklist policy. And please access the training site for your at your convenience, or view the past trainings whenever needed. Upcoming trainings for April. On April 4th, we'll have Evaluating Client Eligibility, the new and non-traditional provider series, a series that is designed to be an introduction to client eligibility under the ESG and ESGCV program components of emergency shelter, street outreach, rapid rehousing, and homelessness prevention. April 7th, Low Barrier Emergency Shelter, a community workshop series, which discusses exactly what it means for ESG and ESGCV shelters to be low barrier. On April 11th, Hiring People with Lived Experience, Racial Equity Series. This session will review the concept of lived experience and lived expertise and show how organizations work together and integrate PLE into decision-making, advocacy, and systems. Upcoming in May, on May 2nd, we'll have Documenting Costs, the new and non-traditional provider series that will cover all of the basics needed to successfully submit an RFF to California HCD for payment. And on May 10th, Data-Driven Decision-Making, a community workshop. This session will explore the use of data in everything from program design to racial equity. Next slide. Do we have any questions at this time? Don't think that we have any. Next slide. So if you do have any questions later, contact your annual ESG rep or reach out to ESG NOFA at hcd.ca.gov or reach out to your grant administrator for your ESG CV questions. Next slide. Now we will turn it over to Mr. Chris Andrews for our Spotlight series on housing stability case management.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I'm Chris Andrews. I've met a number of you. For those who I haven't, I'm part of the ICF team supporting the state's ESG CV program. And today, we're talking about housing stability plans. And before we get started, just kind of by a show of hands, using the reaction button kind of in your Zoom link, I just want to have a sense of who here is familiar, has worked on housing stability plans, has been making sure, has been a part of integrating them into their ESG CV program, and who is this a new topic for? So a show of hands if you are familiar with housing stability plans. Just see those reactions. All right, seeing a couple, if you all can lower your hands, and then for who is this brand new for? Who hasn't worked on the housing stability plan component of their ESG or COC or other homeless programs? All right, and just one more show of hands. Who is excited that it's springtime? Eventually snow is going to be melting, weather is going to get nicer. All right, okay, just making sure everybody's here. Great. If we can go ahead to the next slide. So what is a housing stability plan, right? I think when we're working in services and in shelter and in permanent housing, I think we're often talking about lots of different plans, lots of different strategies for the clients whom we're serving. A housing stability plan has the primary and really the only focus on identifying and addressing the barriers to housing and achieving housing stability. And with that in mind, right, a housing stability plan is really important both for our clients who are not currently housed. Right there, the goal is how to build a strategy, what is the roadmap to assist and support them in securing permanent housing, having that housing stability. And that doesn't end there, right? Once housed, we all know this, right? There are still a lot of steps and a lot of supports and considerations that need to be made so that those clients can stabilize and maintain that housing. And the goal of the housing stability plan is to really provide kind of that roadmap and kind of support for the client to be working off of to establish and then maintain that permanency and maintain that stability. Next slide. And it really kind of boils down to three big things, right? We want to make sure that all of the clients, and really kind of all of the clients, 100% of the clients that we're touching, the goal is making sure that they can, afford and pay their rent, or their rental contribution, that they can follow the terms of their lease, and then meet whatever other obligations, challenges, roadblocks that will come in front of them to maintain that permanent housing for the foreseeable future, right? Making sure that they have their toolbox to be able to address and work through, whatever those obligations or challenges might be. So let's go to the next slide. So how do we make, what goes into making a housing stability plan? Step one, right, is your situational mapping, kind of identifying what are the current barriers, what are kind of currently identified strategies to mitigate or resolve those, or brainstorming what might be ways to mitigate or resolve those barriers. What are the strengths of the client, right? What can you build off in making a strength-based plan, for your client to establish their stability? And then what are the resources available? Who are the programs? Who are the service providers? What are the phone numbers that somebody should be calling kind of as they're looking, into their stability? And then kind of documenting all of those steps, kind of what are those steps to be achieving that permanent housing or that stability, and identifying what are the short-term goals and what are the longer-term goals, and what are the timelines and the milestones to meet those, right? You want to be able to be working off a plan, checking boxes of here's how we are moving this plan forward. And things will happen, right? There will be a pivot, a bump, a change, a shift, and making sure that there is flexibility to address those changing circumstances, and understanding that the housing stability plan is not a plan, built at, day one or day X, kind of early in your work with a client, but it is a living document that will continue to evolve and shift and change, and reflect the progress being made by your client, but also what are the shifting circumstances that that client is facing. So kind of thinking about that in a different way, right? There are kind of 4 stages that go into building your housing stability plan. Number 1 is identifying what are the barriers facing a client, what are those client strengths. Goal, step 2, establishing the goal, establishing the timeline. Step 3, operating, carrying out that goal setting, carrying out that action plan. Okay, we are on, we're on this part of the stability plan. What are the individual steps? What are the individual processes that need to be taken, to continue to support that? And then monitoring progress, right? Providing that accountability and support to make sure that that plan continues to be met. So kind of starting at the beginning, kind of 6, key things that I like to hold kind of in my checklist in that client assessment. 1, and I think this is really important. I think we, do this in a lot of pieces of our work, and I think it's important to hold in developing, the housing stability plan, is making sure that you are communicating the purpose, the process, the goals of the stability plan to your client, and making sure you all are on the same page from the get-go. Then going through the client's history, going through their housing history. What are their preferences? What are they looking for in their permanent housing? running a credit check, looking at evictions, kind of contacting previous landlords, previous employers, understanding what are some barriers that a client might be facing, what needs to be addressed, and what are strengths that you can be building off with that client. And then you're using that assessment, you're using that early discussion, to establish your goals and the action plan, to work with your client. How are they going to be obtaining their housing? Are they going to be facing barriers from a tenant screening perspective, and how are you going to address those? Meeting their lease requirements, kind of maintaining or increasing their income or obtaining employment, being able to budget, kind of to be supporting their permanent housing, building independent living skills, building the skill set to support housing stability, addressing other service needs, and then evaluating kind of debt and poor credit and how can that be reduced or how can that be repaired. And again, kind of just like what we touched on the last slide, right? You're beginning, by having your client be a part of it. They have input, they have kind of final decision-making say on what are the goals, what are the specific action steps, what are the timelines, right? Being able to support them in establishing a plan that they can be carrying forward. And then throughout, and I think this carries into all of the work that we do, being able to use motivational interviewing techniques throughout, supports that process. So thinking about how to be ensuring your client's long-term stability, key activities, making sure they have the education and the awareness to ensure lease compliance. They understand what the lease is saying, right? Leases can be big, overwhelming, complicated documents, and working with your tenant to understand, okay, this is what is required of you in this lease. How can they be budgeting, to be able to contribute to their rental contributions? How can they be maximizing income? What can they be shifting, or looking for in a way to maximize their income? And then continuing to support and build client support networks. So they have, programs, resources, partners, individuals who they can call upon and lean upon for help and support as they're moving forward in accomplishing and achieving their stability plan. So again, in terms of tenant supports, we're being able to explain those lease requirements, kind of going through, what is required of you, what happens, if you do X, this is the outcome, and that's what's said in the lease, and really being able to break that down and provide it orally, bulleting it out, being able to identify, you have to do this at this date, don't do this, or if you do this, X will happen. How to build, relationships, with a landlord and neighbors. Some of that might be role play, right? How are you practicing, conversations or engagement with a landlord and being able to role play that out? How to go through working with your property management, for maintenance, how to follow up, what is expected of you, what is expected of the property manager. And then what to do if something goes, if something goes awry, what to do, if there needs to be mediation, of a disagreement with a neighbor, with a landlord, with a property manager. And then what can be accessed if somebody is facing tenancy issues from a legal perspective, how to provide legal support. to address those issues. And the next piece of it, right, was maximizing income. Right, being able to connect your client with organizations, service providers, nonprofits operating in the community that can help them kind of with employment or improve employment opportunities. Help prepare a resume, prepare work experience, prepare a cover letter, how to fill out a job application, identifying resources or references, being able to identify who those references are that can be used to support kind of that client. Go through kind of the practice interview from the moment somebody would walk in a door, of looking for work, kind of through the interview process, making sure somebody has felt what that is like and has had practice kind of at each step of that interview stage. And then if needed, being able to connect folks with providers working in life skill programs to prepare or better improve job readiness. From a maximizing income, right, can also be looking at, at benefits. Could somebody be eligible for disability assistance? Food support programs, childcare support programs, transportation support programs. And what is someone's medical insurance? Are you able to help enroll and engage them in public insurance? Might they be eligible for cash aid? Right, we're kind of in tax season right now. If somebody hasn't filed for income tax and maybe benefiting from filing, and helping them work through kind of those process or identifying providers and services that can assist them with that. Next slide. And I think as we think about employment and benefits and ways to maximize income, there can be a lot of barriers. And so these might be steps, right? And we've touched on them, but it might be, helping folks complete job applications, write a resume, prep, practice, have transportation to get to appointments and interviews, making sure folks have kind of the necessary documentation, necessary IDs, right? Kind of things that, if they have that packet or package ready to go going into an interview, it will streamline and make that process easier for them and helping them kind of build that portfolio. Taking advantage of other providers operating in the area, folks who can provide credit counseling, can provide translation services, can provide transportation support, childcare support, life skill training. Help identify references, right? And then continue to follow up, right? I think many of us have likely experienced with clients or for ourselves, the challenge of kind of maintaining employment, maintaining benefits, continuing through a job hunt process, how it can be really demoralizing, and continue to provide support to your clients as they work through that cycle. And next, reducing expenses, right? Help clients understand kind of where their money has been going, where they're spending their money on, and making a detailed budget, and then beginning to identify what might be ways to save money. Are there low-cost resources for internet or utilities or phone, right? And there might be state programs, there might be local programs, there might be federal programs that someone could tap into kind of for those different services and programs. Working with credit counselors to reduce their monthly debt payment, right? These can all be action items as part of your housing stability plan. And connecting folks with mainstream benefits, with community resources, making sure that your client is aware of all of the benefits that they could be benefiting from, all of the programs that they could be using, and how to go about accessing them, right? I think, again, when we talk about a housing stability plan, so much of it is kind of breaking down those bigger goals into actionable chunks and providing that guidance of, okay, here is how you apply for, this, utility assistance program. Here is how you apply, for this transportation assistance program, whatever it may be, but really making sure folks have kind of the action items to achieve each of these little goals. And then finally, building that community support, right? I think there are so many needs and challenges that an individual is facing, that a client will be facing as they're moving into permanent housing, making sure they can understand kind of what are all of the different supports that they need that will help ensure and can provide that stability, for ongoing kind of maintenance of their permanent housing. And this list will be unique for every client, right? And it will evolve for every client as they're moving forward, in their stability plan. And so making sure that you have that, documentation of supports, having kind of that laundry list that you can be pulling from and then customizing for every individual. And then as you move forward, make sure that you're monitoring your progress. How are things moving forward? Do you need to adjust? Do you need to change? Reviewing income, reviewing housing, reviewing expenses. What other challenges, are coming up? And can you catch those early kind of in your engagement with your client, so you're able to address them before they become, a large issue? Communicating, checking in with the landlord or the property management company, and making sure, that you are kind of available, or there are peer support groups available kind of on an ongoing basis when somebody needs, to check in, needs help, that they can access you, or access your team if it's through, text messaging, if it's through phone calls, if it's through kind of in-person meetings, if you're going to be at, or have a case manager at a certain spot at a certain time, folks know that and they can just pop in and get help. And then finally, right, some common challenges. If there are questions about who's doing what, you're not likely to get that task done. So making sure, it is very clear who is responsible for what at what point in time. Making sure that you are, providing, that list of who are the mainstream, who are the community resources, right? Who's everybody needed, kind of as we're looking at that graphic of building your community support. Continue to build, right, those connections to those resources. Make sure that your client knows how to access and can access themselves directly, what those resources are, to keep, and maintain their housing. Okay, we already touched, on using motivational interviewing as your tactic for engagement, but tracking and analyzing outcomes. And as you do that, where you are able to celebrate, achievements and successes at every stage, at every piece of the work that you're doing, and you are able to celebrate those with your client. And with that, would love to open it up for questions, thoughts, from, about stability plans and about the documentation of stability plans.
Chris Andrews, while people are maybe thinking about questions or comments. I noticed at the beginning when we did the little show of hands, there were a few people that said that they were relatively new to housing stability planning. And so I just wanted to throw it out there. Through monitoring, we have found we've monitored about 20 ESG CV sub recipients so far, and more often than not, the client files do not have housing stability plans present in them. So I just kind of want to reiterate the importance of this to the folks that are on the call today. Especially if you're not familiar with this, that, that is something that we're going to be looking for with client files. And if there's any type of assistance that you need outside of this, platform on that, please don't hesitate to reach out to your grant administrator.
And Aaron, that's it. I think there's a lot of requirements. There's a lot going on with these grants, and this might have been something that got missed at some point or for some collection of clients. But you can, and should, at this point, if you're realizing we haven't been doing this or we haven't been documenting, go back and go through that documentation for the folks who are in in your current case log and who you're working with.
And Chris, just to add on to what Aaron said, this was a direct reaction from you and me and from the monitoring team that received HUD's findings for California HCD, which said we really want to see these plans in client files. So this is also our opportunity to share that with you and make sure that we can clear that HUD finding by having this conversation and making sure that we move in this direction as a unit. There is a question from Carissa, so I'll leave that to you, LaQuan.
I was about to read it. From Carissa, can you share an example of a written housing stability plan that is ESG compliant?
I will see if we can find an example, that can be shared, or kind of an outline that can be shared. I want to stress, though, and I think there was a second question that just popped up around this too, of is there a format or a form? I think we look to see if we can share a form with you all, but it's important to know that your stability plan will be in some ways unique for every client, right? They will have a different path to housing stability. So I think as long as you're holding that, and what you don't want to do, is just say, okay, well, here's the standard housing stability plan, and kind of put that forth on every client who you're working with. But I think there is, we can look to see if we have a template that we can share with y'all.
And what we'll do is make sure that we attach it to the email that includes the materials for this office hours. We'll send it out with that email.
Thank you. We appreciate it.
You're welcome. No problem. And I guess not to be too repetitive, but just to piggyback on what Chris said, even with the template, we want to make sure, or you would want to make sure, that your housing stability plan is catered to the individual and not just, a blanket plan that you're applying to everyone. So that is something we can keep in mind. Is there anyone that would like to? Oh, go ahead.
Just to answer the question about the format, HCD does not have a current format, but hearing the questions that we're seeing, that doesn't mean we might not build one in the future. So as Chris mentioned, we'll try to find one to show you what it looks like, but we may also build a format for HCD at some point if that is helpful. So if you would find that helpful, go ahead and just toss that in the chat and give me a pulse check on it.
Or Chris, even since we'll have the survey that comes up at the end, if that's something that you don't have time to get into the chat right now, but if you, whenever you answer the survey question after this session, if you will include that in something you'd like, that would definitely be helpful as well.
Looks like the helpfuls have it.
And if there's something else that you're thinking of that came out of this session, feel free to unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask your question since we do have time. Yes, Carissa, that is correct. You definitely want to make sure that, you are meeting the requirements of the ESGCB grant.
And this is also an ESG grant requirement that's going to be long-term and annual as well. So creating some sort of format seems like it's probably in our best interest.
And I think I just want to clarify, I think if you all go back after today and kind of think about what you all are doing in your program, you probably realize, oh, we are having these conversations, right? You're every time you engage and interact with a client, you're already thinking about, what is the pathway and how to maintain stability. So I think really the goal of the plan, right, at this point for most of you is capturing what you're doing in your oral interaction with the client. And just how can you put that into writing so it is becoming, not just a checkbox in your file, but I think more importantly, another format and another way of kind of learning and engagement and support for your client to be saying, okay, here's my path forward. I remember I talked with Chris 2 weeks ago and gosh, what was he saying? Got it. I've got it here. I can still go back to Chris with questions, but I also have kind of that written documentation. So if we're thinking about it from a learning perspective, you're able to, to achieve that kind of in multiple ways. So seeing a question on credit checks. I am not sure of a free credit check website, to be using. I don't know if others have one that they use to share.
Looks like we may have missed a question. Does the housing stability plan also pertain to emergency shelter participants?
So the majority of housing stability, right, is I think looking as you're into prevention and into rapid rehousing, but you are providing and you are obligated. I think someone might just put this into to the Plan 2 rate of providing that case management through shelter, which becomes the segue into building out that housing stability plan, because I think in that, should just be a continuation of building your stability plan of that case management of how to be moving from shelter into permanent housing.
And that does support HCD's emergency shelter policy, where we do not want emergency shelter to be warehousing folks. We want you to be housing folks. So 100%, yes.
Thank you for that link, Aaron. Before we wrap it up, are we sure that we don't have any more questions? Anyone want to come off mute or put your question in the chat? Well, seeing no more, thank you all for your questions. Remember that the survey will launch at the end of this session as you exit. So please, please, please be sure to include any suggestions or questions that you may have in that survey so that we can tailor our interactions with you all to support your technical assistance and training needs. Thank you all for your participation again, and we will see you next week.